In this video, we'll take a comprehensive look at all the death row inmates executed in the United States in May 2025. We'll examine not just the crimes that led these men to death row, but the human stories behind them, the victims whose lives were cut short, the families left to grieve, and the complex legal battles that played out over decades. Before we begin, like and subscribe to this channel if you find this video informative. This is their story. Jeffrey Glenn Hutchinson, Florida. Jeffrey Glenn Hutchinson's story begins on a night in 1998. At 35 years old, Hutchinson was a Gulf War veteran living with his girlfriend Renee Flaherty and her 3 young children. What should have been a typical evening turned into one of the most shocking crimes the area had ever seen. That night, after an argument with Renee, Hutchinson left the house in anger. But he didn't just walk away to cool off. He returned armed with a shotgun, his mind made up about what he was going to do. He shot and killed Renee and her 3 children, 9-year-old Jeffrey, 7-year-old Amanda, and 4-year-old Logan. Shortly after the killings, Hutchinson called 911 himself. His words to the dispatcher were chilling in their simplicity. "I just shot my family." When police arrived at the scene, they found Hutchinson waiting for them, the evidence of his crime literally on his hands. Gunshot residue and bloodstains on his clothes told the story of what had transpired. When Hutchinson was brought to trial in 2001, the prosecution had what seemed like an open and shut case. The physical evidence was overwhelming, and Hutchinson's own confession left little room for doubt about what had happened that night. But his defense team wasn't ready to give up without a fight. They painted a picture of a man broken by war and mental illness. Hutchinson, they argued, suffered from bipolar disorder and had sustained brain damage during his service in the Gulf War. The horrors he had witnessed and experienced as a soldier, they claimed, had fundamentally altered his mental state. In a desperate attempt to create reasonable doubt, they even suggested that others may have been involved in the killings, but the jury wasn't convinced. The evidence was too strong, the confession too clear. They found Hutchinson guilty on 4 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death for the murders of the 3 children and to life in prison for Renee's murder. The years that followed were marked by a series of appeals, each one based on Hutchinson's mental health issues and alleged irregularities in his trial. His case became a rallying point for veterans groups and human rights organizations who argued that his wartime trauma had impaired his criminal responsibility. But their pleas fell on deaf ears. Governor DeSantis signed the execution warrant, denying clemency and setting the stage for the final chapter of Jeffrey Hutchinson's life. On May 1, 2025 at 6:00 p.m., Jeffrey Hutchinson was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison in Rayford. He was 62 years old, having spent over 2 decades on death row. The method used was lethal injection, and the process took approximately 15 minutes, proceeding without incident. For his final meal, Hutchinson chose salmon, mahi-mahi, asparagus, a baked potato, and iced tea. A surprisingly refined last request that seemed at odds with the violence that had brought him to this moment. When offered the chance to make a final statement, Hutchinson declined to speak publicly, though witnesses reported hearing him whisper what appeared to be a prayer during the procedure. The execution drew mixed reactions. Veterans advocates and mental health organizations criticized the state for executing a man with severe psychological issues linked to his military service, while the families of the victims expressed relief that justice had finally been served after decades of legal proceedings. Glenn Edward Rogers, Florida. Glenn Edward Rogers was born on July 15, 1962 in Ohio, one of 7 siblings in a troubled family. His path to becoming one of America's most notorious serial killers began early. He dropped out of school before turning 16 and married his teenage girlfriend. They had 2 children together, but the marriage was a nightmare marked by domestic abuse accusations from his wife. After that relationship ended, Glenn's life spiraled into a pattern of theft, scams, and bar fights. But these petty crimes were just the beginning. Rogers' first confirmed murder happened on September 28, 1995. Sandra Gallagher, a mother of 3, was seen leaving a bar in California with Glenn. The next day, her burned body was found inside her pickup truck. She had been strangled. Rogers fled the state, beginning a cross-country killing spree that would terrorize multiple communities. In Mississippi, he met Linda Price at a fair. She found him charming and let him move in with her, a decision that cost her life. A few days later, Linda was found dead in her bathtub. Rogers had moved on, leaving another victim in his wake. His next stop was Florida, where he murdered Tina Marie Cribbs. Glenn met her at a bar and she offered to take him to her motel room. 2 days later, motel staff found Tina's body in the bathtub. She had been stabbed in the chest and buttocks. Glenn escaped in her car, but his killing wasn't finished. 4 days later, on November 9, 1995, he murdered Andy Giles Sutton in Louisiana. She was found naked, stabbed, and lying on a waterbed that he had punctured. At this point, Glenn seemed completely out of control, a predator moving from state to state. Rogers was finally arrested on November 13, 1995, in Kentucky after a high-speed chase in a stolen car. Following his arrest, he made a claim that would capture national attention. He boasted of killing more than 70 people, though he was only convicted for 4 of those murders. Even more shocking was his claim of responsibility for the murder of Nicole Brown Simpson, the ex-wife of O.J. Simpson. While there was no evidence linking Rogers to the crime scene, O.J. Simpson's defense team mentioned him as another possible suspect in the case. Rogers' brother, Clay Rogers, told CNN, "I'm absolutely certain my brother Glenn killed Nicole Simpson and Ron Goldman. I know he did it because I've seen proof that he was there." In 1997, Glenn was sentenced to death in Florida for the murder of Tina Cribbs. 2 years later, he received another death sentence in California for killing Sandra Gallagher. Despite his boasts, only 4 murders were officially confirmed and prosecuted. Earlier in 2025, Rogers requested a new hearing to present evidence that he had suffered repeated sexual abuse during childhood, hoping the jury would commute his sentence to life in prison. That request was denied. His legal team also argued that Rogers suffered from porphyria, a rare condition that could cause extreme pain during lethal injection, making the execution process inhumane. That appeal was also denied, since Florida does not offer alternative methods such as firing squad or gas chamber. After nearly 30 years on death row, all his appeals were exhausted. On April 15, 2025, the governor of Florida signed his final death warrant. Glenn Rogers woke up at 3:45 a.m. on the day of his execution. For his last meal, he requested pizza, chocolate, and a soda. Simple comfort foods that seemed almost childlike in their innocence. That same day, he received a visit from his wife. His brother, who had traveled from Kentucky, visited him the day before and then returned home, unable to witness the final moments. On May 15, 2025, Glenn Edward Rogers was executed by lethal injection at Union Correctional Institution in Florida. The drugs began to flow shortly after 6:20 p.m., and he was pronounced dead at 6:30 p.m. According to eyewitnesses, Rogers appeared to suffer for about 10 minutes. His body trembled slightly and his breathing was irregular. It was not an immediate or peaceful death. When asked for his final words, Rogers gave one of the most bizarre statements heard in recent times. "I know there are a lot of questions that still need answers. I promise you, you'll have them very soon, and I hope that somehow it helps you close this chapter." Then, with unsettling calm, he added, "President Trump, keep making America great. I'm ready to begin." The reaction in the room was confusion. Randy Robertson, son of one of the victims, said, "I wondered, where did that come from?" His wife, Amy Robertson, who also witnessed the execution, said, "I thought, what the hell did he just say?" Even in his final moments, Glenn Rogers managed to bewilder everyone in the room, leaving behind a legacy of horror and one last line no one saw coming. Benjamin Ritchie, Indiana. It was September 29, 2000 in Beech Grove, Indiana. It started as a routine night for local police and ended in tragedy. That night, a white pickup truck was reported stolen at a nearby gas station. Shortly after the theft report, Officer Matthew Hickey was at the scene of an unrelated traffic accident when he saw the stolen truck drive by with 3 men inside. He ran the plates, confirmed it was the stolen vehicle, and called it in. What followed was a chase that ended in the death of a young police officer. The chase began immediately. 2 more officers joined the pursuit, Robert Mercury and William Bill Tony. But the truck didn't get far. After a short pursuit, it crashed off the road into the yard of a quiet neighborhood home. The doors flew open, and 2 of the men ran into the darkness. Officer Hickey quickly caught one of them, Michael Greer. But the second man, Benjamin Ritchie, just 20 years old, ran hard through the suburban landscape. Officer Bill Tony chased him through backyards, jumping fences, dodging sheds and swing sets, in a desperate pursuit through the residential maze. Suddenly, Benjamin pulled out a Glock pistol and fired 5 times. Bill was wearing a bulletproof vest, but one of the bullets struck just above it, hitting his chest. He managed to fire once before collapsing onto the grass, his service weapon dropping from his hand. Officer William Bill Tony died there in that backyard one day before his 32nd birthday. He left behind a wife and 2 young daughters. He had only been a police officer for 2 years, his career and life cut tragically short. After the shooting, Benjamin Ritchie vanished into the darkness. Somehow he slipped past the perimeter and made it to a friend's house, still free, at least for a while. Over 100 officers, SWAT teams, deputies, and investigators launched an all-night manhunt. Roads were blocked, neighborhoods shut down. Finding Benjamin Ritchie was urgent, and no one was going home until he was caught. Hours passed, until there was a break. An anonymous call led them straight to a house. When officers arrived that morning, Benjamin was inside. This time he didn't run. He didn't resist. He was arrested without a fight. The house belonged to Michael Moody, the 3rd man from the stolen truck. He was arrested too. The manhunt was over, but the real battle was just beginning in court. That's where Benjamin Ritchie's true story came to light. Born May 30th, 1980, Benjamin came into a world already stacked against him. He never met his biological father. His mother, Marion Martin, abused alcohol and drugs, even during pregnancy. She worked as a stripper, constantly moving, never offering stability. By the time Benjamin was just 3 years old, his mother had already abandoned him twice. When he started school, the damage was obvious. He misbehaved, couldn't learn, and by 9th grade, he dropped out entirely. At age 10, he was admitted to a psychiatric hospital, where he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and other cognitive issues caused by his chaotic upbringing. He needed help, but the system had little to offer. In August 1998, just after turning 18, he was arrested for robbery and sent to prison. By 2000, he was out, but not free. He was still on probation, directionless, and his life remained a mess. His troubled past hadn't ended, it was just waiting for another chance to catch up with him. And on September 29, 2000, that's exactly what happened. After his arrest for the murder of Officer Bill Tony, the prosecution acted quickly. Within weeks, Marion County announced they would seek the death penalty. But this wouldn't be a quiet case. Benjamin had already given a jailhouse interview, claiming the shooting was an accident. He said the gun slipped and that he heard multiple shots while running. One of his friends backed him up, saying Benjamin never meant to fire, that everything happened too fast. According to him, Benjamin panicked during the chase. He was already on probation, and another arrest could mean 8 more years in prison. That fear, he said, is what pushed Benjamin over the edge. But the damage was done. A police officer was dead. On August 10th, the jury gave its verdict, guilty on all charges: murder, vehicle theft, unlicensed gun possession, and resisting arrest. At sentencing, Ritchie's lawyers tried to save him. They argued he had brain damage, that his mother used drugs while pregnant, and that he grew up in chaos without a chance. They painted the picture of a broken boy who became a broken man. But the jury didn't see it that way. On August 14th, the jury made its decision. After just 3 hours of deliberation, the verdict was unanimous. Benjamin was sentenced to death. He was transferred to Indiana's death row, and for many that would be the end. But for Benjamin, not yet. Thousands of miles away in Sweden, a woman named Ivana saw a documentary about death row inmates. Something about Benjamin stood out to her. She couldn't explain it, but she couldn't get him out of her head. She wrote to him. The letters turned into conversations, and soon Ivana flew across the world to meet him. Separated by glass, they fell in love. For nearly 4 years, Ivana kept coming back. The Indiana Department of Corrections allowed it, even for a condemned man. And in case you're wondering, yes, Indiana's death row is different. Benjamin had a real cat in his cell. That's not a metaphor. In Indiana, death row inmates are allowed to keep cats as pets as part of a program to reduce isolation and improve behavior. For years, Benjamin filed appeal after appeal, but no one would listen until the date arrived. May 20th, 2025, almost 23 years after entering death row. In his final weeks, Benjamin asked for clemency. He told the parole board he was sorry, that he wasn't the same man who pulled the trigger in 2000, that he still had something good to offer. But there were no chances left. At 44 years old, Benjamin Donnie Ritchie was executed by lethal injection in Indiana. For his last meal, he chose Olive Garden's tour of Italy, a plate with chicken parmesan, lasagna, and fettuccine alfredo. Shortly after midnight, the execution process began. His last words were simple: "I love my family, my friends, and everyone who has supported me. I hope you all find peace." At 12:46 a.m., Benjamin was pronounced dead, ending a life that had been marked by tragedy from its very beginning. Matthew Johnson, Texas. Matthew Lee Johnson's story begins in Dallas. His childhood was marked by a devastating lack of supervision and early exposure to drugs. He started smoking marijuana at just 7 years old, an age when most children are learning to ride bicycles and playing with toys. By high school, his drug use had escalated dramatically. He was using crack cocaine and PCP, substances that would fuel increasingly erratic and dangerous behavior. At 19, he married a woman named Daphne, but his addiction quickly worsened to the point where friends once had to tie him to a bed due to his manic, drug-fueled behavior. In 2004, his addiction led him to commit a drug-fueled robbery for which he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Ironically, prison may have been the best thing that happened to Matthew during this period. There, he managed to stay sober, improved his attitude, and even took a parenting course, showing glimpses of the man he might have become under different circumstances. After his release in 2009, Matthew remained clean for several years. During this period, he had another child, got promoted at his job in a mechanic shop, and found some stability. However, in 2011, after buying their first house and facing financial stress when his wife lost her job, Johnson relapsed. The pressures of adult responsibility, combined with his underlying addiction issues, proved too much to handle. It wasn't until 2012 that Matthew Lee Johnson committed the most horrific crimes ever seen in Garland, a suburb of Dallas. On the morning of May 20th that year, he entered the Fenwip convenience store where 76-year-old Nancy Judith Harris worked. Nancy was a beloved grandmother in her community, known for her kindness and work ethic. Johnson came prepared for violence. He brought with him a bottle of lighter fluid and a lighter. He approached Harris while she was behind the counter and poured the flammable liquid over her head. He then forced her to open the cash register. As she tried to comply with his demands, desperately hoping to survive this nightmare, Johnson stole 2 lighters from the display, 2 packs of cigarettes, and even a ring from her finger. But Johnson wasn't finished. Once Harris finally opened the register, Johnson took the money and then did the unthinkable. He set her on fire. According to court documents, Harris, engulfed in flames, desperately ran to a nearby sink, trying to put out the fire that was consuming her body. Meanwhile, Johnson casually walked out of the store and even paused to grab some candy before fleeing. He ran through the neighborhood, stripping off his clothes as he went. When police finally caught him, he mockingly said, "What took you so long? You're getting slow." Nancy Harris was rushed to the hospital with 2nd to 4th degree burns covering 40% of her body, including her face, chest, arms, legs, and hands. For 5 agonizing days she fought for her life, enduring unimaginable pain. On May 25, 2012, her family made the heartbreaking decision to authorize the removal of life support. Nancy left behind 4 sons, John, Brian, Scott, and Chris, who would spend the next 13 years seeking justice for their mother's brutal murder. An hour after the attack, Johnson was arrested and confessed to setting Harris on fire. At trial, he claimed he was under the influence of drugs and alcohol and hadn't intended to kill her, only to scare her. The prosecution highlighted his extensive criminal history, painting a picture of a man who had repeatedly chosen violence and crime over rehabilitation. The defense presented witnesses who spoke of his role as a father and his ongoing battle with addiction, trying to humanize a man who had committed an inhuman act. In 2013, Johnson was sentenced to death. Since then, he filed multiple appeals, all of which were denied, including one by the U.S. Supreme Court in 2024. His most recent appeal, where he accused the Texas Attorney General of influencing the timing of executions, was rejected by the Fifth Circuit Court just 2 days before his scheduled execution date. Matthew Lee Johnson never claimed to be innocent. According to his attorney, he was deeply remorseful for what he did. Since being on death row, Johnson tried to rehabilitate himself. He completed a faith-based program and worked from prison to be a positive influence on his wife and daughters. hoping they wouldn't follow the same destructive path he had taken. But remorse, however genuine, could not undo the horror of what he had done to Nancy Harris and her family. Johnson was executed on Tuesday, May 20th, 2025, by lethal injection exactly 13 years after the crime. It took place at the Huntsville unit north of Houston. His execution was the 4th in Texas that year, and the 18th in the United States. Elizabeth, Nancy Harris's daughter-in-law, witnessed the execution along with her husband Chris, Harris's sons Scott and John, and granddaughter Shelby. Afterward, she stated firmly, "We had reached the point where we were just tired and wanted it to be over." The truth is, there's no such thing as healing. Days get easier, but you never fully heal. According to reports, Matthew Johnson had requested ice cream as his last wish, but that request was denied. When asked for his final words, he said, speaking slowly and clearly, "As I look at each one of you, I can see her on that day. I please ask for your forgiveness. I never meant to hurt her." Oscar Smith, Tennessee. Oscar Franklin Smith's story begins at a Waffle House in Nashville, where he met Judy Smith, who worked there as a waitress. They married in 1985 and soon after had twins, creating what appeared to be a blended family with hope for the future. According to court records, Oscar had a history of threats and abuse that escalated over time. He pointed a gun at one of his stepsons, physically and sexually assaulted Judy, and threatened to kill her multiple times. The dream of a happy family was becoming a nightmare of domestic violence and terror. The couple eventually separated and began divorce proceedings, along with a fierce custody battle over their twins. It was during this contentious period that Oscar took out life insurance policies on Judy and the children. On October 1st, 1989, shortly before midnight, a 911 call came from Judy's house. The dispatcher could hear screams and an address before the line went silent. Police arrived within minutes, but they found nothing unusual at the scene. It wasn't until the following afternoon that the true horror was discovered. A 13-year-old neighbor made the gruesome discovery. Judy, 35, and her sons, Chad, 16, and Jason, 13, were dead. All three had been stabbed and had their throats slashed in a brutal attack. In addition, Judy and Chad had been shot, suggesting a killer who wanted to ensure his victims were dead. The scene was one of unimaginable violence, the kind that haunts investigators for the rest of their careers. 3 lives had been brutally ended, a family destroyed in a single night of rage and violence. The investigation quickly focused on Oscar Smith, and for good reason. A bloody handprint found next to Judy's body matched his left hand, even though he was missing 2 fingers, a distinctive mark that made identification certain. But perhaps even more damning was what investigators discovered when they enhanced the 911 call. A voice believed to be Chad's could be heard screaming, "Frank, no! Oh my God, help me!" The use of Oscar's middle name suggested that Chad knew his attacker, that this wasn't a random home invasion, but something far more personal and terrifying. During the trial, Oscar claimed he hadn't committed the murders. He constructed an elaborate alibi, saying that on the day of the crime he had breakfast with Judy and the kids. Then she went to buy a car. Later, he said he went out with the twins and dropped them off at his mother's house before heading to Kentucky for work. But the jury didn't believe him. Prosecutors argued that he had returned that night after dropping off the twins to commit the murders. In 1990, Oscar Franklin Smith was found guilty of triple homicide and sentenced to death. At the sentencing hearing, his lawyers tried to avoid the death penalty, arguing that Oscar had paranoid personality disorder and a family history of schizophrenia. Still, he was deemed mentally competent to stand trial. In a bizarre twist that revealed something about Oscar's mindset, it was revealed that he refused to plead insanity because he feared it would prevent him from getting a mortgage in the future. A concern that seemed absurdly mundane, given the gravity of his situation. In 2022, his execution was halted at the last minute by Governor Bill Lee due to issues with the lethal injection protocol. But that stay was not permanent. Eventually, the governor announced he would not grant a new clemency hearing, sealing Oscar's fate. Oscar Franklin Smith's execution was rescheduled for May 22, 2025 at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville. For his last meal, which is typically limited to $20 by the state, Oscar requested hot dogs, tater tots, and apple pie with vanilla ice cream. Simple comfort foods that seemed almost childlike in their innocence. When asked for his final words, he said, "Someone needs to tell the governor that the justice system doesn't work "I didn't kill her." Smith died from an intravenous injection of pentobarbital at the Riverbend Maximum Security Institution. He was pronounced dead at 10:47 a.m. on May 22nd. Even in his final moments, Oscar Smith maintained his innocence, taking his version of the truth to the grave and leaving questions that may never be fully answered. These 5 executions that took place in May 2025 represent different facets of America's complex relationship with capital punishment. Whether you support or oppose capital punishment, these stories demand our attention and our reflection. They remind us that justice is never simple, that every case carries with it the weight of human tragedy, and that the decisions we make as a society about life and death will continue to define who we are as a nation. What do you think about these cases? Do they change your perspective on capital punishment, mental illness in the justice system, or the possibility of redemption? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this video informative, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more in-depth looks at criminal justice issues. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss our upcoming videos exploring the complex world of crime, punishment, and justice in America.